Great. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I am delighted to be here today to moderate this really important panel following on the opening remarks that we heard from our commentators on the Rose Review and the UK Code. And we're delighted you could join us for this conversation. My name is Wendy Teleke, and I run the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative, or WeFi, which is housed at the World Bank, and is a multi-donor initiative to support women entrepreneurs in emerging markets around the world. And we work with the multilateral development banks in about 53 countries to provide support on finance and advisory. So we're great to have you here. I have three amazing panelists. I will allow them to introduce themselves, but Frances Evans, Julie Baker, and Jennifer Tankard, thank you for joining us today. And thank you to Inez and the Financial Alliance for Women for having me here. They know that this is an initiative that is very close to my heart. It's one I'm really excited about because I see the huge impact that it is starting to have in the UK and that it could have in many of our markets. And I think the fact that, as you heard from Alison Rose earlier, the fact that they launched the UK Code just over 2 years ago, and they have 100 financial service providers from around the country who have signed on to this, including all the major banks, agreeing to take new measures to support women entrepreneurs and to start tracking that data is really exciting. But WeFi, we work with a lot of financial institutions through our multilateral development bank partners, and we know what a challenge it is to get financial institutions to track data. And then, as Stephanie von Friedenberg earlier said, not just to track the data, but to use the data in ways that will actually get more financing to women entrepreneurs. And the code is really just a brilliant way to solve many of those problems by bringing different actors together to create the right incentives and carrots and sticks to make sure that collecting data is not only a easy process, but a useful process in making it happen. Or maybe I won't use the word easy because I know it was not easy making this happen, and we'll hear more about that. I wanted to let everybody in the audience know the Alliance has worked with a number of others to create a case study on the code, which is available now and should be popping up on your screens. It's just being published as we speak. And it's a great overview of how it worked and what the key success elements were of the code as we think about how we might move that into other markets. Before we go to the panel, I just wanted to mention one thing, because there was a question put to Alison Rose about the success of these initiatives. One of the things that came out of the first report on the code was that in the UK, over this first year, which was a time of crisis and pandemic, women and men had their applications for funding approved at the same rate. And this does not seem maybe like a really extraordinary claim, but I wanted to compare that to data that we have now from the World Bank, which shows that globally during the pandemic, women were rejected from their loan applications at twice the rate that men were rejected during the crisis. This is a huge call to action for us, something that we're very concerned about. And I think what we see in the UK is that they did not fall into the same trap. And I think the code can take some credit for that because of the focus people have had on women in the UK. So with that, let me move into the discussion. And I'll ask Frances to start and introduce yourself, Frances, when you do. But the first principle that you'll see in the case study that was, one of the leading success factors was the strong collaboration between the private and public sector in implementing the code. And I wanted to ask you, what was the government's impetus in reaching out to Alison Rose in the first place? And then what role did the government play in bringing so many other actors together for this effort?
Sure, that's a good question, because that was very much the foundation of our work. Let me begin by introducing myself. My name's Francis Evans. I'm head of business finance at the Department for Business, which is part of UK government. And what that means is I'm interested in the policy on access to finance for companies and for individual entrepreneurs, rather than the financial services sector itself. So why did we reach out in the first place? Well, I think that government needs to have a certain sense of humility as regards its own powers. We're not a command and control economy. We can't require businesses or lenders to act in particular ways, but we do have some levers at our disposal. And two things that government can do well. One is to signal, to set the tone, if you will, through its actions and publications, and the other is to convene. And one of the great privileges of being a government official is that pretty well everybody will talk to you, and you can gather different private sector players together and invite them to collaborate. Now, of course, they won't always do that, and the context may not be right, but you have that platform, if you will, that unique position as government. And so initially we asked Alison, who, for those of you who heard her speak earlier will know, is a remarkable person, very able and very values driven. I'm sure that came through in her talk. And so you had there, matching government's convening power, a highly credible and capable private sector leader who was well placed to convene the private sector lenders and to have that understanding of their position.
Great, thank you. And we did see what an amazing role she played. And I think some of it has to do with getting the right people who really want to drive this kind of effort forward. And as she repeatedly said, see it as a team sport and not a competitive sport, so that you're really an open book and willing to work across the different boundaries, both public and private sector. So that's really an exciting part of what we've seen here. Julie, I'm going to go to you next. NatWest was a key driver of the process as one of the as probably the anchor bank in the Rose Review and the Code. And as we see from the case study, one of the key design principles of the Code was a voluntary approach to reporting data. So without the strong regulatory intervention, which I think is counterintuitive to many people. Many people think this is going to be a regulatory requirement, and then banks are forced to do it. And that might be a more direct line to getting the data at the end of the day. Why do you think the voluntary nature of the Code was so important and has contributed to the rapid uptake of the Code by the financial sector in the UK?
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Great question. And like Francis, I'll kick off first of all by introducing myself, and then talk about the Code, and in particular that data collection. So my name is Julie Baker. My job title is Head of Enterprise and Climate Engagement and Partnerships at NatWest. But what does that really mean? Well, the enterprise element of my role means that myself, my team work with partners from both the private and public sector that are as passionate as we are about supporting entrepreneurs in the UK, but especially those from the less privileged or more disadvantaged groups, and who would believe that 51% of the UK population, women, would fall into that, but yet in business they are a minority group, with just over 20% of businesses run by women. So I was delighted back in late sort of 2019 when Alison asked me to support her with the work on the Rose Review. So I worked alongside McKinsey and Alison right from that stage to where we are now, and it's been an absolute privilege to be on that journey. So delighted to be here today, and delighted that within my team we do have the Women in Business specialists, of which we're hoping to have 1,000 before the end of the year. And Alison did briefly touch on these, but these are relationship managers that go through an accreditation, a USP to NatWest, so that they can understand the barriers faced by women, but especially how to provide tailored support so that it can overcome those barriers. But today I'm here to talk about the code. And as we discussed already, that initiative number 1 of the Rose Review was to promote greater transparency in UK funding allocation through this code. So Wendy, you asked me around the voluntary commitment of the bank, and we felt this was really important. And to get the voluntary commitment, we did need to work in collaboration with those key influencers in the early days. And those key influencers were from government and they were from the finance industry. And it was government that helped influence, if you like, some of the financial CEOs. Alison herself got involved with phoning other co-CEOs to actually get their buy-in. And we did actually, when we asked the signatories to sign up to the code, to get senior buy-in from actually an executive of the financial institution, because what we found, and it certainly happens at NatWest, if you get senior buy-in, they're an influencer within your organisation, and if they want you to collect data, then absolutely you will collect data, but you'll be doing it for the right reasons. So it was really important that we worked in collaboration with government, with the likes of UK Finance, which are the governing body, but also those original 20 founder signatories to the UK Investing in Women Code, to actually have honest discussions around the table, and these were hosted by UK Finance, to talk about what data can we collect, how difficult is it, what are the challenges to our organisations, you know, and how can we sort of keep this as simple as possible so that actually it's meaningful and we're truly transparent in the reporting, but actually we work within the parameters that we set. And of course, those original signatories, they included mainstream banks. There were the main banks that had been there forever, like NatWest, Lloyds, Barclays, but actually there were the challenger banks included in there that have much more agile systems, but different challenges came with that. And then, of course, we have other financial institutions like the VCs and the business angels. So it was never going to be a one-size-fits-all. But the key thing that they all had was a senior buy-in, an exec buy-in when they committed to the code. And what we found, it wasn't just the reporting of the data in the end, they also committed to adopt to and share best practices that benefited or benefit female business owners across the country. So it was really good to be able to share in the regular Rose Review updates those best practices, which include mentoring examples, they include events, they include lots of initiatives. And programs that the bank share. And whereas before this probably would have been deemed as competitive secrets, actually now it just shows that by collaborating and working together, it's a much, much stronger environment.
Okay, great. I mean, I do think that's one of the key reasons this is so exciting, is that it's really, you know, bottom up from with the private sector, with the government, and not a top down solution. I wanted to go to Jennifer next, and Jennifer is with UK Finance, and this is another part of the secret sauce of the code, and we've cleverly assembled this panel to include somebody from the financial sector from a bank, someone from government. But the third element, which I think really is what makes it work at the practical level, is the trade associations, who are really the go-between for the financial institutions and the data collection process, because they're working with their constituency to bring together the agreement on what the data is and everything. So UK Finance itself is the largest trade association of banks in the country. So could you talk and give us a little bit of, you know, really the details of what the role of UK Finance is in the development and later on in the implementation of the code, and, you know, especially the data gathering stage, and how did the reporting mechanism work through the trade associations? And introduce yourself before you start to answer the question.
Thank you, Wendy, and just say how delighted I am to be on this panel this afternoon. So I work for UK Finance. I work in our commercial finance team, and I'm responsible for leading on a range of policy and advocacy issues in regard to access to finance for small and medium enterprises. So the commercial finance team were very closely involved in this. UK Finance represents about 300 financial service institutions across the UK, and that ranges from NatWest, you know, some of the really big global players, down to some really small specialist banks as well, who are also providing business finance in the UK. So UK Finance, as a trade association, we already play a significant role in collecting a wide range of data from members. So we sort of had the systems and processes in place to facilitate data collection, and most importantly, to facilitate secure data collection. And when we were engaging with our members on this and persuading them the value of signing the code, signing up to the data collection system, we were very clear that the data would only be shared publicly at an aggregated level. And so it was only UK Finance who actually saw the individual submissions from lenders, which gave members confidence that, you know, there would be this collective picture shared, that there wouldn't be, you know, any ranking of different financial service institutions, and that, you know, that we would act as sort of managing that. And because, as I said, we already collected a wide range of data from members, it meant that our data and research team, and for those banks that had data and research teams or had dedicated data people, that where there were problems, we already had those relationships, so we could sort out problems where there arose. Some of those were quite technical in nature, systems just not talking to each other. Sometimes there were just issues more generally with sort of template that UK Finance developed, send out to our lenders to collect. I think it's worth, I made mention earlier that, you know, that we do have that huge range in the size of our members, from the very bigger banks who will have slightly more dedicated resource to lead on some of these policy issues and to do this sort of data. And as you get down to the slightly smaller players, quite often you'll find it's people who already have a full-time job who are then having to do this, you know, as a sort of side of the desk type exercise. And so, you know, we did do obviously a bit more support for those banks where they were either struggling with data collection or having issues sort of accessing our systems. And I think it's worth remembering contextually in all of this that we were trying to do this in the middle of a pandemic. Mm-hmm. So we were flat out, all our members were flat out delivering support schemes, government guaranteed support schemes to help businesses through the pandemic, and sort of pushing out, getting those schemes up and running and pushing out money to those businesses. So a lot of lenders generally, and lenders who'd signed up for the code, were already really thin on resource availability because they'd sort of dedicated a lot of that resource to pandemic response. So I think it sort of swings and roundabouts, because in some sense I'd say if you're going to do this, don't do it in the middle of a pandemic. But on the other hand, the fact that we did manage to do it in the middle of a pandemic, I think shows the level of commitment to this, and the fact that we still saw that as a priority, you know, and we wanted to understand, as well as generally understanding what the picture was for women in terms of access to finance and getting, you know, being able to access lending from banks, but also having that snapshot about how was the pandemic affecting female entrepreneurs.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer. That's great context, and I think people can see the important role that you played. When we work with banks in emerging markets, it's not a trivial matter to get them to start doing this. And it really takes a lot of work to make sure there's agreement on, you know, the definitions, on the types of data, the indicators that you're looking for, and then also the mechanisms for transmitting that data. And there's a capacity building role that in your case, you know, you're playing by working together with them on a day in and day out basis that I think is really a critical part of the success story. So let me go back to Francis, and you know, we've talked a little bit about the mechanics, but I wanted to get back to the purpose. Why, from the government's perspective, of all of the 8 recommendations in the Rose Review, The first one was the code and data transparency. So it's not always intuitive for people when you say, what's the biggest bottleneck for women entrepreneurs? That, you know, the number one thing you're going to be recommending has to do with data and commitment of financial institutions to do more, you know, financing, but also collecting the data. So why is that data transparency so important for you?
Sure, and you're right, it isn't obvious. And when we asked ourselves the question, what's the biggest bottleneck for women entrepreneurs, we realized we didn't actually know. Was it that they were reluctant to apply? Was it that when they did apply, they faced discrimination, whether deliberate or not? Is it to do with the sectors that they're in or their networks? There are many reasons. And you mentioned earlier on, this is the statistic that once female entrepreneurs apply, their success rate is similar to that of men. So for example, that kind of information is really valuable. So the reason, to answer your question, the reason we started with data collection was that we realized we didn't understand the issue well enough, and that it isn't straightforward. It's a multifaceted issue, and before devising solutions, you'd better understand the problem. So that was certainly one reason. Another one, which I would endorse from an earlier collaboration that government did on women on boards, on the boards of quoted companies, is that numbers do have a certain power. So if you can say, in the case of women on boards, women are half the population, but when we started out, around 12-13% of board positions, that's clearly unfair. And similarly, through the Investing in Women Code and some research that's been done, we've found that a very small proportion of money that's raised goes to women entrepreneurs, smaller than the proportion of female-owned businesses. So just highlighting that disparity and having then a benchmark that you're aiming for. So numbers have a certain power, especially if you can track them from 1 year to the next. It's sometimes said, what gets measured gets done, and I think there's some truth in that. But I do think in conclusion, it's just worth mentioning that the Investing in Women Code does not only commit the signatories to collecting data, they also sign up to doing something about it.
Yes.
And so I think that is an important qualification, if you will, that measuring the scale of the problem so that you can better define it is absolutely not sufficient. And there is sometimes a temptation when faced with quite an intractable problem to say, let's commission another study. We don't understand it completely. Let's get some more numbers. But we shouldn't allow the need for understanding to prevent us from acting once we, you know, as soon as we are clear that there is an issue there. We don't have to have 100% understanding. It is important to act as well as to measure.
Francis, that is the perfect segue for my next question to Julie, which is, as a former manager of the Women in Banking program at NatWest, what was your own data journey? Like, what did you see in terms of the data gaps and the need for data to help you make those decisions on what to do about it, as Francis was saying? Because the data is the tool. It's the tool to getting the decisions and the attention of management and the resources to actually, you know, put more money out there for women and find ways to do that more effectively. So as a, you know, how did you see that from a financial institution perspective, both, you know, in terms of identifying the gaps and what you do with the information, and what data do you need? What are the indicators that you actually want to be looking at, and how did you decide, you know, in this case, what indicators would be important for helping decision making?
Yeah, no, I love questions around data, Wendy, thank you. So this journey for me goes back to December 2016, which was when I was really looking closely, had a new ex-business consultant boss that had just joined the organization, and every conversation with him was around data and challenging me on, you know, all of this support we give to or provide to women, is it working? So the first thing I did was challenge our data and analytics department to say, look, we need a baseline of data here. I need to know how much of our lending goes to females, how many of our deposits, the share of wallet. Let's look at service measures. And I was really hungry to get as much data as possible. And it was by pure coincidence that the following Easter, the Global Banking Alliance, now Financial Alliance for Women, was hosting one of our academies at The Hague, which fortunately I got to join. And for me, that was the start of the journey, because I got to hear from the likes of Westpac, who had been on this journey for a while, BHC Lebanon, that the learnings from other banks from other countries of the value of that data. So from that year on, we linked to all the business support that we were providing through the events, through the mentoring, through the workshops, and like Alison said, more recently, through our accelerator programs, of which 60% of those attending our accelerators are now females. We've been able to track the trends and see what support for female founders work. So it's been really important for me individually, but also for the bank, for my team, to actually get that buy-in. I've been able to show the business case for supporting women and actually to get more investment to help us on that journey. Alison talked about the 250 billion untapped potential if women were to open and scale businesses at the same rate as men. So absolutely, for a financial institution, you want to be attracting as many females as possible because you want your fair share of that wallet. So, and you want to be, you know, implementing sort of programs to support them. So data is key to everything we do. It's really exciting to be able to track sort of the trends. And another sort of exciting trend since we launched the Invested in Women Code, which purely relates to lending, only 9.5% of our overall lending pre-COVID went to female founders. That's 100% female owned. It doesn't include mixed ownership. Last year during COVID, 14.5%. Now, I know that isn't a huge uplift, but actually it is when you think in the scheme of things during a year like COVID. And so then you take the step back and you hold round tables and you talk to those female founders that have borrowed from you and ask them, you know, why did you actually, you know, sort of reach out to the bank? And they said, really like the digitized process. I like the way I didn't have to come into the bank and speak to sort of a corporate manager. I like the way I didn't have to prepare complicated cash flow forecasts. And I like the simplicity. And do you know what, at the moment, touch wood, all of those repayments are coming in and it's working well. So we've got to take the learnings from that. But it all goes back to the data, because, you know, if we do something and it doesn't work, you know it isn't working because of the data. And if you implement something and it does work, you can do more of it and you can share that best practice with the other sort of founding members. And that's absolutely what we do every year. In the Rose Review Progress Report, we showcase best practices, not just from NatWest, but from all the other banks and signatories as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think, yeah, your journey is probably very similar, but a little advanced for many of the participants on the call today. But the most important thing is to take the first step. So if your first step was going to a Financial Alliance for Women event, then here we are ready to go. And I would just give another plug for the case. And one of the things in the case that I found really interesting is it talks about the data that's being collected, and it's different data for different types of institutions. So it's not exactly the same for banks as it is for venture capital funds, et cetera. You can look more at the detail there. And before we go to question and answer, so you're welcome to submit your questions, please, through the system. I think it's somewhere on the lower right of the screen, if I understand correctly. We'll take a few questions from the floor, but I did want to ask Jennifer, you know, data is powerful, and one of the problems with data being powerful is that people don't want to share it. So I wanted you just to say, you know, Julie has explained very well why, from a proprietary bank perspective, that data is very valuable, but once you take it into a code and a discussion about how data can be looked at across a country or a system, people can get very nervous about that. So can you talk a little bit about the conversations you had with your members and what they were concerned about and how you got them comfortable with that?
Exactly. So you're right. I think people are always nervous about sharing their data. And especially from a financial services perspective, banks aren't always the most popular institutions in any country. And so there is always that issue about trust, and not just, the public trust, and banks working very hard to rebuild that trust and protect that trust and protect their own reputations. So I think there was some real concern, about what the data would say, because nobody knew at the starting point collectively what it would say. It could have shown a massive imbalance at the decision-making point, although individual members were quite confident that for them, it wouldn't show that. Mm-hmm. But, they don't know how they're going to be lumped in with a, collective story. Mm-hmm. And, what that narrative might show if it did show an imbalance. So it was sort of quite good that we came out where we came out. But at the same time, having said, banks might have been nervous about that collective piece, at the same time making sure that we were publishing it, for a broad section of different lenders, and not doing a sort of, ranking of who's better and who's worse, I think did give them comfort. And certainly we didn't just work with them on collecting the data. When we came to reporting and writing the report, we were keen that lenders also had some involvement in building that narrative and providing those case studies. And I think, as Julie's mentioned, it can sound like we've got the data collection, we've got the good practice stuff going on there, but those things are really tightly linked, because without the good practice, there is no strong narrative about not only where we are now, but the direction of travel. So where we are now has been supported by a range of initiatives, some of which have gone on for some length of time, about supporting female entrepreneurs, not just at the banking stage, but at, this sort of stage about when they're thinking about setting up a business and navigating that journey, and definitely more needs to be done. But, having those good practices sort of embedded into a report was really important. I also think, we have issues in the UK, I'm sure we do in other countries, concerns about the process of data collection and the security around that. But because we had our tried and tested systems in place to do that data collection, we could provide that reassurance about how data would be managed and handled as well. And we very much sold the reporting as an opportunity, and this sort of showing of good practice as an opportunity to showcase what banks are doing in this area, because it doesn't actually get as much profile as perhaps it should. So, we sort of sold that in as an opportunity for lenders.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. And from what I've seen from the report so far, the data all is reported in aggregate. So it's not in the report coming out on a financial institution by financial institution basis. Of course, the financial institutions see that, you see that, but it's is there an expectation that it would become public at some point? Or is that expected that it would remain, just aggregate numbers?
So our expectation is definitely that it would remain aggregate, because we are very lucky in the UK to have a very diverse and competitive business lending sector. And as I said before, we've got some big established players, but we've got a lot of quite small, very niche players. And I think, you can easily pick through those if you publish them separately and say, well, why is this organisation, only focused on doing that? A lot of this quite often comes down to sort of a sector basis. So we know that there's some sectors, business sectors, where you've got far more men involved than women, and other sectors that are you've got far more women involved than men. And so if you just release data without it being aggregated, without doing that, then you're not actually looking at a very balanced picture about what's going on economically for female entrepreneurs.
Great. Thanks so much, Jennifer. That's really important, because I think these are the kinds of things that can create hesitancy when you're trying to get really a massive number of actors to work together on something that otherwise they would see as potentially threatening or problematic. So it's great to see the balance that you've struck in the UK that really makes people feel comfortable, or institutions feel comfortable participating in this, and gives them the ability, they're creating their own systems and their own ability to track and analyze the data in ways that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And I think the case studies, as you pointed out, are also really important, the best practices, because everybody's learning in this process. We all are. Let me go I'm open to questions, but I don't see any yet. It might be something's not popping up, but let me ask each of the panelists to just do a quick discussion about what haven't we talked about that you see as really the critical elements of the code, and particularly as you think about this, when you think about other countries implementing the code, you know, and taking this from step one to, you know, to the conclusion of this process, you know, what do you think the key design principles, additional design principles would be that you would advise others to take into consideration?
I thought
Oh, sorry.
Jennifer
Yeah, Francis, you can get started.
I was really going to echo what Jennifer said a moment ago. It's really worth bearing in mind that we benefited so much from the work that UK Finance had done, individual banks had done, in having some of these data collection systems set up, and in the role of UK Finance as a trusted third party that all of its members know it has their best interests at heart, it will protect their information, they're not sharing something with government that they don't quite know what government will do with it. So as I think you mentioned at the outset, Wendy, that having those three partners of the lenders, the trade association, and government, each of those has a vital role to play. And so I would say it took longer than a couple of years for that data collection to happen and to be set up, and then we benefited from it in the last couple of years as the code got underway. So sorry, it's maybe a slightly boring technical point, but the infrastructure of data collection takes a little while to get right. And by the same token, don't be discouraged if it feels like you're making slow progress, because it just does take time.
Okay, Julie, maybe you could quickly give your thoughts on that. And let me just add, maybe I'll club these together. We do have a question in the chat now about resources. So the question is, you know, how was this funded? Was there a big, you know, funding budget for this, or was it dealt with, you know, how was it dealt with? And I think each of you probably have to answer that, because I think it probably, you know, you each have your own answers for that. So Julie, two things. First, any additional design elements, and second, on the budgeting and resource side.
Yeah, even before Francis had spoken, I'd written down trust and the importance of the governing body, and then collaboration. And they are so key. Without all of those, it just would not work. And I think that is so important. The other thing that I'd just like to call out is with data, because there is a concern, I know, particularly personal data. No personal data is shared whatsoever. It is all aggregated. But the great thing about this data is you compare what is lent to women in comparison to male counterparts, in comparison to mixed ownership, and it is really, really useful and helps you design those things. So all of those initiatives and interventions to support females going forward. So, and I'm sorry, the second part of the question from
resources. Resources. How was this resourced?
So Alison Rose was very much, as soon as she was asked by government, she did put a hand in her pocket to support, and McKinsey's did the same, to actually support the initial research. However, when it came to the Investing in Women Code, everybody stepped up to the mark. You know, UK Finance, Jennifer and team found extra resource from somewhere. It just, you know, it's one of those things, it's what you make a priority for. We did the same. It came very much part of my Women in Business team in their day job. And Francis, I know at Beige you've had different people throughout the years. So it's actually everybody given a little bit of resource, and not, if you like, a huge investment by one person. Again, it's a huge collaboration. And I want to emphasise the importance of that senior sort of signatory on the buy-in, because that is the easiest way of getting that resource as well.
Great. Okay, so Jennifer, your thoughts on kind of the key essential design elements, especially as we think about replicating this, and How did you guys fund this, and how did you resource it, your work on this?
Thanks, Wendy. So I would say in the design element, it's finding that sweet spot between setting up a data collection process that gives you data that has some sort of tangible meaning, and therefore that you can act on. So you don't want to do data collection for the sake of data collection. You want to find those questions that give you something useful to work with. But you can't design a process that's so cumbersome that people find it too difficult to resource and that they can't do it, and it becomes really problematic. So we went with a fairly simple approach of just analysing lending by salutation. So when people sort of fill in, you can analyse it that way. That did lead to an issue in that about in 25% of cases, you couldn't tell whether the borrower was male or female because they'd either used gender neutral salutations like professor or doctor, or they'd chosen not to do that. But again, that's getting the balance, isn't it? You want a system that everybody can do and that's easy to do without sort of creating something that's becoming very resource intensive to build. In terms of resource, I'd emphasise what Julie just said. There was no additional resource provided. So, everybody did this because they thought it was the right thing to do. So it was just built into existing workloads, and just a priority to get done. And it's the same in every lender who provided that data and who collaborated. There was no additional resource there. They were doing it all with their day jobs and on top of responding to the pandemic. And I think I made the point earlier, but that shows that people did see it as a priority to get the data collected and get that job done.
Great, thank you, Jennifer.